Yes, friends. For the second time on a Monday, it's OGP, the One Giant podcast. As you know, if you know, the New York Football Giants made news again here on a Monday, finally coming to the conclusion that releasing James Bradberry was the only way to go. We're going to go ahead and talk about this from a few different levels here. Obviously, if you watch the podcast that came out at high noon, as we've been doing over the last handful of weeks, you'll know we started that discussion around James Bradberry, some of the moves they could choose to make, but there's still going to be great content over there talking about the comments from Brian Dable and Joe Schoen regarding Daniel Jones and also updating the compensatory pick projections for the New York Football Giants. But as it stands right now, this is about James Bradberry being released by Big Blue. We said there was a number of factors to consider here over the last week and a half or so. You got these drips and drabs of information. Joe Schoen saying on WFAN in an interview, we thought there would be more of a market there for James Bradberry. We also had Joe Schoen mention that it takes three parties to get this done, right? The New York Giants, the trade partners out there on the market, and then James Bradberry himself. And I think one of the things that we took away from it, as we'll get into the details here around cap implications, there's a name floating out there for free agent targets that the Giants could look at on the low cost, but also what Joe Schoen and the Giants accomplished by doing this now, as opposed to, as we discussed earlier, the potential of keeping him around, seeing if a trade partner developed, or even having a veteran, experienced, talented cornerback on this roster here for the New York Football Giants. But the one other thing that you took away from Joe Schoen this past week was when he said we thought there would be more of a market. And we've mentioned it in passing about how the New York Giants had James Bradberry 2 years ago when it was right there, man. Top of the list of cornerbacks you wanted on your roster. Incredibly talented, really putting his best foot forward for Big Blue. Cut to a year later, he has a bit of a down season. Now, whether or not that's predicated on him or predicated on the system, the general flux around the team, and what the expectations were, it doesn't matter. I think that probably hurt his market value here when we discuss this. We will, as if you're in on the live stream here over on YouTube, discuss the potential of, as we also said earlier, who's going to be on the board here, right? To potentially look to attract James Bradberry on the open market. We'll get to that in a second, and some of the very real in-division concerns around that. But just from a high level here, the New York Football Giants release James Bradberry, and we understand you free up a little bit north of $10 million. So that's going to help you in getting this rookie draft class signed. Obviously, any other moves that you're going to want to make. The other piece that it does is it allows you to say, let's wait and see on some of the other decisions that we need to make. Let's just use Darius Slayton as one of the examples. He's a fifth-year wide receiver. We don't expect the Giants to be bringing him back on another contract after this season. We don't necessarily expect him to be on the roster going into this year. However, when you look at the inside of this wide receiver room, and there's question marks even in the short term around will Sterling Shepard be healthy, let alone be on this roster potentially too. We don't know where Kenny Golladay is in terms of the level of quality of play. Where is his ceiling now lie? You have a rookie in Robinson on the roster. We mentioned the other day on the show, Richie James is in here now. Robert Foster is in here now. People are excited about Andre Miller, a lot of rookies. Alex Bachman is still here. CJ Board was brought back, right? There's this whole host of names. And $2.5 million is not an insignificant amount if you were to release Darius Slayton. But now, having released James Bradberry and freeing up this short-term money, you can at least say, hey, let's see how these other players flesh out for us before we make any decisions. And it doesn't mean that it could be 3 days, it could be a week, it could be Friday afternoon after they see the rookie minicamp and what some of these players can bring to the table from the wide receiver position, that a decision could additionally get made around Darius Slayton, because this isn't just one-to-one. We talked about it also on the last episode that you can go and watch again, some more context around there for this team, that the New York Football Giants need to free up north of $13.5 million. So this move alone does not accomplish every aspect of what the Giants need to do, but it's obviously the biggest one-to-one. You release James Bradberry, you get the maximum amount of dollars that you can back underneath the cap here to get other things done. The other picture that I want to talk about here is the salary cap implications, because just from the standpoint of freeing up the money that they did, but the other part that I think is important to look at is when you talk about the New York Football Giants going forward after this, where is their dead cap money going to sit in years to come? And I'm going to get this up here in a second if I can, because Joe Schoen, in as we said at the top, if you said, well, he's a quality player, and we talked about this over a number of episodes, you may think he doesn't fit the system perfectly, but he's still a talented player. And whether or not he's not going to be great in man coverage and you're going to want to use him more in zone setups, okay, you can maximize his value in smaller percentage opportunities and then move on from after the season, etc. But what was it going to look like in the big picture? They have now, the Giants, taken the dead cap dollars and put them here in this season. It's a big dead cap number, but it'll be gone after this year. And that's as important as anything that you're going to be able to accomplish. The other reason that I think they maybe push pause here, as we see Terry coming in on the live stream conversation as well, is what happened or did not happen for them in the draft. So this is where I think, again, they were weighing their options. Do we release a handful of players now or this one player? And if things had gone a little bit differently, and I still speculate that had it been that Sauce Gardner was there at 5, the Giants would have been excited to take him because it's a 1-to-1 replacement. Now you have your starting corner across from Adoree Jackson, and now it doesn't hurt nearly as much to outright release James Bradberry and lose a starting caliber cornerback, right? In the NFL. So had that gone that route, I think it would have looked differently around the timing of it. And then to Terry's point in the live stream, what about Andrew Booth Jr., right? There were opportunities certainly to draft them there. And we talked about a potential guest that's going to come on here. It's going to be around the draft class, decision that the Giants made, and maybe other options that they could have gone with. But I do wonder what was their thinking around, if not Sauce Gardner at the top, how far back are we willing to push and wait? And if not Sauce Gardner at the top, how much of a reality was it potentially that James Bradberry would still be on this roster, right? Did that push them to say, not only are we going to draft Flott, but we're also going to draft Belton? Because now we're moving into the sum of our parts, right? We're not talking about, well, it's Adoree Jackson and it's James Bradberry across from one another, or it's Sauce Gardner and Adoree Jackson across from one another. And then the pieces in between, we can go ahead and flesh out along the way. Instead, you're talking about opening up a hole. And we talked about Aaron Robinson and liking who he was coming out of USF last year. And hopefully he gets every opportunity to have success on the outside. But this is a big hole. And this is something that Andy and I talk about every single episode throughout this offseason around releasing players. You release players, you create capital underneath the cap to work with, but you also create a hole to fill. And that went back to whether it was the Daniel Jones conversation, which was never really a release opportunity, but even the Saquon Barkley one, right? If you released him or traded him, whatever it was, you were going to create this new void. If a trade had materialized for Saquon Barkley, you then turn around and say, well, how high in the draft should they look to replace him? Is Breida going to be enough? Right now, you get to say whatever the big picture is on Saquon Barkley. We have him for the short term. We have Breida. We have Corbin now. And we feel like we're creating a process to move forward with. So that was the other big component about this, I think, from Joe Schoen's standpoint. If I'm going to take the hit, I want to take it now. Because as every Giants fan understands, what happened over the last decade is nothing short of impressive in a lot of ways. Because not only did the Giants afford themselves to lose a ton of games, to burn out the back end of Eli's career, to inexcusably have Geno Smith starting games, all that good stuff. They also managed to completely ruin the financial standing of the franchise. Usually, if you're this bad, you have so much capital to work with in the offseason that you can try to throw money at solutions. And instead, the Giants have to rebuild not only the roster, but also the cap. So the Giants did that by releasing James Bradberry, and that's a big part of it. Shout out to DL over there in the live chat as well. Yeah, and I do agree with you. Will you talk about Rodarius Williams? Something that Andy pointed out was the measurables on Williams and the fact that even though he's only 6 foot, and change there on the outside, he also is someone that has the ability with his wingspan to play a little bit bigger than his size would say. I don't want to misquote it. Andy had it up like 80-inch wingspan, which would be the equivalent of the average 6'2", 6'3" cornerback on the outside. So that certainly makes a difference as well. Oh, he was released there. Excuse me, as we're doing a live stream here. Batch, I don't know if you were in here from the beginning. I said it right off the top. James Bradberry was released. He's no longer a New York Football Giant. He's not on the roster. They officially released him. So we'll just go ahead and round it out for anyone coming in. We're on the live stream, so I appreciate if you're here from the top or just getting into it. So we'll continue to hit this every couple of minutes here. James Bradberry was officially released. The Giants are taking the dead cap hit, and they're gaining themselves a little bit over $10 million in cap flexibility, which is going to, of course, afford them the ability to get into the rookie draft class and get those signings taken care of. So that's the big piece of it. There are some players inside of this roster that can get some things done for them, but one of the big names that we can talk about as far as the free agent targets that we could look at has been mentioned before, that the New York Football Giants had opportunities in this offseason. They only made marginal pickups, right? Little bit of help across the offensive line. The biggest weakness of this team. Let's focus on the offensive line. Let's make sure that we bring in some veterans to stabilize it. We know we're going to go back into the draft as well and fill in those needs also. They brought in some players like Ward inside of the defensive unit, right? So they made little marginal moves here. But one of the big names from Baltimore that, this goes into discussion that we had earlier, Andy and I, about Jimmy Smith, a 33-year-old cornerback who has ties to Wink Martindale and his time in Baltimore. The value of him would be bringing in an experienced cornerback that, in the same way, while Bradberry wasn't a one-to-one fit in the system, veteran cornerback experience in the NFL. So let's get this guy in this room here with these young players. Now, though, if you can get it at the right price point, which should be a little bit north of zero, because a 33-year-old cornerback, I don't know how much on-field value he's going to have, but you can certainly add film room value. You can add locker room value with a player like Jimmy Smith because he can help coach up all of these young players and hopefully maximize what they're going to be capable of when it comes to getting on the field. And if you want to be optimistic around what the Giants can accomplish this season, you're going to need this defense to make plays, right? You have now Thibodeau there. You have Azeez Ojulari on the other side. So you're going to be able to get some pressure there. But you still do need to have these secondary players make impact plays in big moments. It can be the difference of getting the quarterback off his spot, throwing off his timing, making him look to get the ball out of his hands a second sooner than he wants to. And if those passes are intercepted versus being broken up, or if they're caught as opposed to even being broken up, right? So these are kind of, I think, in the margins when you look at the impact of releasing Bradberry. This is what we're going to talk about. When we're in the middle of the season, we may be able to look and say, if this year was about trying to improve the wins and losses, well, keeping around a player like Bradberry obviously would have helped that. But if this is about the development of these young players, which we all, I think, for the most part, agree is the case, then you start to look at it and say, when Flott almost gets the pick, or when Aaron Robinson, when Rodarius Williams, right? When Xavier McKinney, if Julian Love is still there, Belton, when they almost make a play, although we have bigger expectations for a guy like McKinney, obviously, having some now experience. If they almost make it, and then in weeks 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9, 10, they do make those plays, that's the value of putting these young players out on the field and saying, yep, you're going to make mistakes. Hopefully, you're going to learn for them, and you're going to be that much further along in your development going from year one into year two. DL hopping in there with, as I forget, I always forget, I can throw these right up here on the screen for everyone to see. Yeah, and this has been the push and pull. I've had this discussion. We've talked about, for me personally, I'm still going to come back to the idea of, was there value in hanging on to this player and just riding it out? Because the dead cap number next year in the final year of the contract was under 2 million. The real big piece of it is, did James Bradberry want to be here? Did he want to be a part of this? Because the value of a veteran cornerback is only true if he wants it. And something that Andy has brought up with consistency is that he was a Dave Gettleman guy, right? Dave Gettleman drafted him in Carolina. He went and got him in free agency. So, like a number of players that we heard after the Joe Judge and Dave Gettleman era ended in New York, there were a handful of players that said, hey, listen, I liked that coach. I liked that GM. I have a strong connection to them, and it made them returning or sticking around on this roster a little bit different. So that's where I think this is an all parties happy to be parting ways, even if it makes the Giants a little bit weaker. So just once again, right off the top, make it clear here for anybody that joined the stream late. This is, of course, the Giants releasing James Bradberry. Finally, little maybe a day late. If you want to say the whole week ends on a Sunday, it's only one day late for Joe Schoen. But ultimately, they do release him. He will be on the open market, and we'll hit up one more. I saw another comment come in here, and then we'll talk about the big concern. Mike comes in with, it's not really a mistake. He has no choice in the matter if Bradberry wouldn't go along. Yeah, yeah, and that's it. Again, you could say it's a mistake in terms of the value of releasing him, the dead cap hit versus if you're already paying him, right? But we highlighted this. How many other players had to go here, and how short-sighted might some of those other decisions be? Whether it's going to be, we mentioned this on our episode released today at noon, whether it was a Nick Gates coming off of injury, veteran player, who knows, who cares, right? He could be a cut here. Shane Lemieux, guy coming off an injury, fifth round pick, showed some flashes. He could be a depth piece. Maybe you'd like to keep him around. Darius Slayton, until you know what you have in the wide receiver core with some of these younger players, not the worst thing to keep around. Julian Love, not the worst thing to keep around. When you start to look through, I mean, even guys like Carter Coughlin, like Cam Brown, right? There's a laundry list of names, young names, that you'd like to be able to see if it's possible for them to develop in this new system on either side of the ball. Whereas James Bradberry, no matter what, he wasn't going to be here long term. So that's, I think, kind of the balancing act that we're, of course, talking about. Let's take a look here, a couple more comments before we discuss the biggest concern, I think, around this. It seems as if Bradberry wasn't a fit for Wink. That is 100% correct, LJ. Yeah, and that's the interesting part. Joe Schoen mentioned, as LJ is saying, did he overplay his hand? Again, I go back to, I wonder if Bradberry had closer to a season like he did 2 years ago versus last year, what would this market have looked like? And I think that's the big difference here. If Bradberry had played at a higher level this last season, then I think teams would have been willing. The question mark again comes back to, if teams were offering, for sake of argument, a fourth round pick, a late fourth round pick for Bradberry, and the Giants were willing to take that. But again, Bradberry was letting those teams know, I'm not going to play for you if I don't get a contract extension. So if that's being communicated by James Bradberry's camp, then those teams like the Raiders or the Chiefs early in the process are saying, well, why am I trading for him then? What we're looking for, by the way, and these other teams, is to steal a guy on a 1-year rental, especially a team like the Chiefs, right? Ready to win now. We want to plug you in, get maximum value for a year, and then not bring you back. And that's something that James Bradberry doesn't want to do, right? Uprooting, moving, changing teams. It'll be interesting to see how his market develops now that he is completely free and clear. And we'll get in on these comments as well. More from Mike, more from DL here. But don't forget, speculated last week, one of the first teams in line for James Bradberry's services is going to be the Philadelphia Eagles. They have a need. He is a talented player. And man, if you're a New York Football Giants fan, I think this is, again, what we talked about. If there's any world that you could move him somewhere else, or the old, keeping him on our team, if you could manage it, might be worth it. Because I tell you what you don't want to see is James Bradberry picking off Daniel Jones in week whatever, as we'll get into with the schedule release coming out here on Thursday night. So we'll know when they're going to see division rivals Philadelphia. You could have James Bradberry lining up, picking off passes, right? Disrupting Kenny Golladay. And by the way, if you talk about from a matchup standpoint, Kenny Golladay not running away from anybody, James Bradberry could be a really effective defender against him. So that's one of the, I think it's a secondary concern, but it's still a reality, right? Who's going to get better from him? If it's an AFC team, nobody cares. Even if it's an NFC team, nobody cares, as long as it's not in the division. And I won't be shocked if Philadelphia makes a big push for him. Let's take a look here. Just a couple more comments. Yeah. But everybody, and you know what though? Everybody knows it. And that's, I think, to Mike's point here too. Everybody knew the Giants were in this tough spot of having to clear draft space, right? So it's not really a matter of, hey, we could keep him if we want to. The restraints were there, and unless you saw the Giants release some of these other players around the roster, it kind of made it clear that James Bradberry very much represented the all or nothing decision for Joe Schoen. And the only difference was something that he said early, and we did see restructures with Sterling Shepard. We saw restructures with Blake Martinez. He said it was something they wanted to avoid. He tried to, but ultimately wasn't able to avoid it in a number of different instances. So the transparency piece around Joe Schoen, we like the directness and the honesty. And yet, is there any other way that you could have played this where maybe it would have garnered a little bit more interest earlier in the process? Hard to tell. That being said, though, this again effectively represents the end, obviously, of the James Bradberry era with New York Football Giants. It also represents one more component removed from the previous regime and the previous coaching staff. We are now down to, right, if Darius Slayton gets cut here, if Julian Love gets cut here, if Shepard doesn't make it out of training camp, there's only going to be so many players here of significant value on the roster that will be holdovers, let alone what happens with the draft class and the undrafted rookies that are going to be brought in here. A lot of the back end guys I mentioned before, a Carter Coughlin, a Cam Brown, they're going to be on the hot seat here and potentially in a position to be overtaken by some of these other names that were brought in. But end of the day, this is James Bradberry being released by the New York Football Giants and finally allowing us to move forward with this offseason. Know that the Giants can start to bring in this rookie draft class. We'll see what those numbers look like as they move along. Mini camp set to start on Friday. So you'd like to, even though we saw different levels of when guys sign their contracts as far as the rookie deal. So it's not the end of the world, but I think being able to move the needle on a little bit of that process is going to be important as well. We'll go ahead and just throw up here because I don't think Terry didn't get up here before. The cost was too much, and last year was too inconsistent. Might as well get younger guys on the field. This is again, I agree with you. I stay away. Some of the names you're mentioning, again, Jimmy Smith, familiar to the system. I don't mind that. Boye, I'm hesitant on. Fuller, I'm hesitant on. This is for me. If you get a guy that you think brings value for Wink Martindale and communicating a system, I'm all for it. Outside of that value, I want the young guys on the field. I want Aaron Robinson on the field seeing what happens. I want Flott on the field seeing what happens. I want all of these young players getting reps and getting experience because while wins and losses matter and we'd like to see more wins this year than we have in the past, this is a multi-year process to turn this thing entirely over. And what I'd really rather have is multiple check marks around an Aaron Robinson. Now he's a holdover. Can he do it? Confirm that for me. I don't want to see that he's splitting reps with a veteran necessarily because we don't know if he can handle the full load. Some of these things may flesh themselves out of the course of camp. If you bring in a veteran like Jimmy Smith, even at 33, and he's able to overtake a guy like Aaron Robinson, then maybe get your answer anyway, right? Same thing for Rodarius Williams. A guy like Darnay Holmes, I think, is very much on the chopping block here as it stands right now. So we'll have to take a look and see how it fleshes out. But we may not get that information for a little while here because, again, I think the last thing we'll talk about as we get out the door is when you look at, as we like to say on the podcast, at the end of the day, when you look at this roster, it's going to be about training camps getting underway around the league, the Giants getting some confirmations around holdovers from the previous regime, and then as cuts happen. So, there's a laundry list of guys out there right now. And again, ties like Jimmy Smith may have a real opportunity. But I think a lot of the names that you may start hearing about are going to be the ones that get released from other teams around the league. So right now, there's this group of guys that didn't get signed, guys that couldn't catch on anywhere, and they're waiting to see what happens around the league. And then it's about every other roster needing to cut down their size and see what's going to happen next. Let's throw this one up here just because, hey, check out the enormous all cap. I like it. Do you think our draft class was out of need because of turnover in roster or to upgrade the O-line? Well, it's a both and. I mean, it's a both and. You can go by any position, right? Top of the draft class, that's out of need. We need an edge rusher to get after the passer. We need a guy like Evan Neal to protect the quarterback, whether it's going to be Daniel Jones or someone else going forward. Now, when you get to a guy like Wan'Dale Robinson in the second round, that is out of need and also maybe a little marginal hedge around, is Kadarius Toney going to be a part of this team going forward? And I mean second contract. I'm not talking about the rookie deal. I want him to be here. He's obviously electric. These guys can be a dynamic 1-2 punch. But you can be thinking now and also 2 or 3 years from now. Ezeudu, I think that he can come into camp and win a starting guard job here. But at the very least, you know that a player like Shane Lemieux, fifth round pick, doesn't have a lot of traction necessarily with this regime. A guy like Matt Pert, third round pick, doesn't have a lot of traction with this regime, right? Likewise for McFadden, likewise for Beavers. So it can be a both and. You can like the prospects coming in and also understand that no matter what, it's 30%, 30 to 40% of your roster gets made in the back half of the draft class. And we said this before, it's going to be 60, 70% turnover on this roster potentially. And by the time we look back 2 years from now, 15% of this roster could still look the same and only at a handful of key positions. So that's, I think, the difficult task that we're talking about for Joe Schoen. And it's one that just as Giants fans, we have to understand. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to be easy. And some of the moves, like releasing James Bradberry, is a product of, well, we didn't pay him this big contract. That wasn't on us. We didn't put ourselves in cap hell. And unfortunately, talent and money are two parts of the equation that they have to do all the time here. So again, me personally, I didn't hate the idea of keeping James Bradberry around if they could manage it. And we will touch back on this later in the offseason when we start to see other releases and the timing of them. If a handful of names that we've talked about before come off of this roster, you will hear me on the podcast say, could we have done this, 3 weeks ago, a month ago, and seen what happened? Because the last thing we can mention too is don't forget that the Giants, if the big if a market had materialized for Bradberry later in the offseason, they would maximize the cap saving and minimize the dead cap hit. Something that didn't look like it was going to go that way. But that's a discussion for another day. Let's put it that way. Ultimately, James Bradberry released. We wish him nothing but the best, by the way. I loved him when he was on the team. I think he carried himself the right way. And of course, fingers crossed, we do not see this man show up over on Big Blue. That'll end the conversation around that. If there's anything else that we want to discuss here, though, because I see everybody in on the comments. Awesome. Great to see everybody showing up here. Again, I'll remind you, be in on Thursday, live stream coverage of the schedule release. And we'll just talk about where those divisional matchups land, how many primetime games are going to be on the slate here for the Giants in the upcoming season. Where does that London game with the Green Bay Packers slot in around other games they're going to have to consider, travel and otherwise? I think it was put out there the last handful of days. Giants are top 3 or 4 in miles that'll be traveled this upcoming season. So for whatever that's worth, I did a little bit of legwork on, how does that impact record outcomes? The problem is the Giants have been bad. So whether they traveled the most miles or the fewest miles, they've been a bad football team. So it's hard to kind of drill down there. But if you have any other questions or comments just around James Bradberry being released or the upcoming minicamp, feel free to shout them out. We'll throw them up here for a few minutes and we'll probably close it out here in 5 or 10 minutes or so. No, Mike, we don't wish him the best if he goes to Philly. I wish him the best if he goes to the AFC. The ultimate best that I wish him is if he goes to the AFC. I wish him well if he goes to the NFC team anywhere in the NFC. And then I don't wish him anything but bad luck. Outside of the one thing we never wish on the podcast, I do not wish injuries on him. But I maybe would wish that he looks a little bit longer in the tooth than we realized over the last couple of years, and he can he can find himself struggling in coverage. Let's put it that way. We go ahead and get Cruzon 26 up here. Yeah, Washington is going to be one there as well. So we're certainly talking about, again, division opponents are going to be having conversations around this player. And the big one too, and I also see here, we'll throw this up because this is a name we've mentioned. This team before, it was mentioned earlier in the season, right? Off season, excuse me. Harold Adams mentions the Raiders, right? There's ties there, there's connections there, and there was a need there. One of the teams like the Chiefs, they kind of addressed it in both free agency and in the draft. So that makes it a little bit tricky as well. Jeff, bring it up. Well, this is the interesting part. Can they cover for it? Yes. Collectively, I think they can. James Bradberry functions so much better in a zone scheme. If you're talking about going man to man, if you put out anyone man to man versus a zone scheme, well, Bradberry versus a young player, if you have the quick hips to turn and get upfield and coverage, well, that's going to be better than what James Bradberry is capable of doing. Go back to last year, watch the film, right? When he was getting beat, it wasn't because he got lost in the coverage or because he didn't know where the ball was going to go. It was flat out he didn't have the legs to keep up with the passes downfield. So you consistently saw him trailing in coverage. That's just a product of not having the speed or the quickness. When you go into a zone defense scheme, heavy scheme, then James Bradberry is able to play back, cover an area, and then get downhill and attack in his coverage. Unfortunately, if you're going to be in Wink Martindale's system, a lot of different ways they're going to manufacture the pressure. But if you say, hey, you're going to be out there on the island, that's a problem for James Bradberry. So that's why I think, as you see, NYG Jeffy getting in here, Robinson is the guy. Yeah, this is, and it took me a couple of episodes to kind of remind myself about how much I liked him when the Giants drafted him. Again, this can be one of the positives that came out of the previous regime. If you're going to have a player like Aaron Robinson out of USF, we know what he brought to the table from a prospect standpoint. The 40 time is there, the size, the strength is there. It's just a matter of seeing him get out on the field and show it with consistency. So as training camp gets underway, that's what you want to see. I think it'll be fascinating to watch with Wink Martindale. Do we start to see patterns around where certain players are lining up as they're getting their reps? Or is Wink saying, hey, Robinson, we're going to move you on the outside. We're going to shift you into the slot. We're going to, flot. We're going to use you in a couple of different plays as well. Or are we going to see a guy like Rodarius Williams, right? What is his role going to develop into? Belton, he had, a little bit multifaceted, play some safety, can play down at the nickel as well. So will you see a rotation of how these players are executed, which can have its value, just defensive versatility, a lack of consistency in terms of what the opposing offense can expect? We see Aaron Robinson lined up here. That's what it means, right? As you shift and run players in motion, can you just go ahead and say, hey, if the player comes from the outside and moves into the slot, we're just going to pass off that coverage assignment, or are we sending players specifically to follow assignments on the field? So I think there's a lot of opportunities for the Giants, for Wink Martindale to have versatility there. It's just going to be a matter of what we see them develop over the course of this offseason. Sorry, had a inappropriate message up there in the live chat, so we got rid of that. So it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see how it works out. Hopefully, Robinson, remember, he's still coming off an injury, 100%. And that's, by the way, we talk about this too. Brian Dable, Joe Schoen, right? We want consistency, reliability, and that's really more than anything. It's not about the skill set of some of these holdovers. It's the health, right? Rodarius Williams dealt with injuries as well. So that's as much as any factor as anything too. It's not even about are they good or bad or can they be productive? Just can they be healthy? And that's something that if we look at this secondary, say a lot of young players, a lot of talented players, a lot of opportunities, gotta wonder, what does it look like if you suffer one injury, right? If one guy goes down, a lot of this excitement gets a little bit mitigated. And I'm seeing Jeffy also pull up. Yeah. Little nicks and bruises for Dory Jackson. He's a very interesting player, right? When the Giants went out and got him, it felt like, hey, the contract is good contract. You like the player. He came off an injury and then came over to join Big Blue. Had little dings and nicks there along the way, but you like him. What does it look like now when he is the sole number one corner, right? Is he going to get overexposed, or opposing offense is going to play away from him and look to attack some of the younger talent here? So you'll see that too as we get, this is big picture into the regular season, right? How much does Adoree Jackson have to bear the brunt of some of these matchups based on the fact that you just don't have 100% the lockdown player on the other side of him? And that could benefit. Maybe Aaron Robinson benefits from the fact that they think they can pick on me. I'm going to go ahead and show them that I can hang with these players on the outside. And a couple of big plays over here, all of a sudden, they have to start working through their progressions more. All of a sudden, that pressure from the front seven is able to get home more. And this is the give and take that we talk about with having a good team, a balanced defense, is doing enough to force the team to have to make an adjustment where then you can have successes in other areas, whether it's in the secondary, forcing turnovers, ball hawking on the back end, or getting pressure on the quarterback, getting sacks, getting fumbles, and changing that field position. So these are all the kind of things we're going to, of course, be diving into more as we work our way through here. Front four also has to garner a ton of pressure. Yep, exactly. 100%, man. This is a big part of, I think, what we're talking about. And I saw some other comments saying they're not done yet as far as the Giants and who they're going to bring in. I believe that. I'm not. You're going to see veteran cornerbacks brought into camp here along the way. I don't doubt that. I personally would prefer the younger players be the ones you move forward with in the short term, but we'll see how it fleshes out. Taking a look here just at Terry real quick. Yep. Yeah. The young players getting in here, showing what they're capable of doing. And then just again, it's the growing pains. That's the biggest component of this. It's going to be the growing pains for the Giants as an organization. And it's a good thing. It's a good thing when the growing pains are about getting younger and about hopefully building a roster that you can be excited about going forward. Players that you think are going to be here for their second contracts, something we don't get to say a lot when it comes to Giants draft picks here along the way. So that being the case, as we know, the official news that came down, James Bradberry released. It affords Joe Schoen more of that flexibility he needed to sign the rookie draft class and make additional moves along the way. We said it over on the on our episode that came out at noon today. I'm going to try to go back and edit that. First segment is about James Bradberry, but then after that, we talk about the compensatory picks. We talk about the commentary from Dable and Shane as it regards Daniel Jones and just some things that we can think about leading forward. But the rest of this week, we're going to talk about Mike Kafka and how his system can positively impact this wide receiving room, the running back room as well, just the offense as a whole. We'll start to flesh out where the depth chart can kind of look as we work towards the mini camp. Same thing for Wink Martindale on the defensive side, Brian Dable, just who are the players that benefit the most from this system, whether holdovers or picks that came in along the way from undrafted free agency and the draft class as well. So we're going to break all that down. We have a big guest we're hoping to get on here. Won't make it official until we lock him into the schedule. Coverage of the schedule release on Thursday night as well. And then a preview of the rookie mini camp and just some expectations that we would like to see there as well. We say it on these last handful of episodes, going to continue to say it. The level of interaction, man, people being in on the live chat right now, enjoying the podcast more on YouTube, really, really appreciate the support. So if you're following it, awesome. If you share it, great. It means the world to Andy and myself. So we're going to be here all off season, 5 days a week, breaking down what it really is. There's going to be so much movement over the course of these next handful of months here, where we're going to get a real clear picture around who can have success for this team and who can be cornerstone pieces for this franchise going forward. You like, subscribe to the YouTube channel. You get the podcast where you get those needs fulfilled. And as Andy would want, need, and may demand that people know if he were here, as always, with a fond farewell to James Bradberry, let's go Big Blue.